Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Chinese New Year to you all. My name's Duncan Stonehouse. I'm the head of school at Bangkok Prep, and I'm also the co-chair of the professional development team with ISAT. So welcome to this afternoon's ISAT webinar. This afternoon's ISAT webinar is going to be led by Stephen Jackman. Stephen is currently the head of curriculum music at Shrewsbury International School in Bangkok. He's worked at Shrewsbury for the last 5 years, and before that he worked as a music teacher in Malaysia and in the UK. Steve is also an Apple Distinguished Educator and Professional Learning Specialist, and Steve provides hands-on training in digital pedagogy and strategy, advocating the creation and creativity of integration of technology in education. He's currently working on a Masters in Digital Education with the University of Edinburgh, with a focus on how digital technologies shape learning. And we're delighted to have Stephen with us. He will be talking about blended learning and blended learning approaches and digital techniques which can support blended learning, and also how to design blended learning activities. I'm sure that Stephen's insights will be very useful to us all, and I'd like to thank him in advance. There may be a chance for some questions, so if near the end, when Stephen sort of asks for some questions, if you could use the chat message, and then I'll be able to maybe ask Stephen some of the messages, selected messages from the chat session. And also the PowerPoint and the recording of this will be available on YouTube and ISAT's website following this meeting as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Stephen and thank you very much. So Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Right, let's get this started. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm Steve Jackman, and welcome to this webinar on blended learning. Today, I'm going to give you a quick introduction. We're going to cover approaches to blended learning, designing blended learning activities, and look at some digital technologies available to support blended learning, and looking at how to design those activities. Before we get started, a favorite tool of mine for blended learning is Padlet. It's like a pinboard for sharing ideas and resources. So today I've set up a Padlet for all of us so we can share our thinking together and take the resources away and share more widely with our community. So if you have a camera-enabled device, you should be able to use the QR code to access the Padlet. Just kind of turn on your camera and scan that, or you can just follow the link tinyurl.com/ISATblend. So if you could just have a go at trying to access that, that would be great. So if you take a moment to look around in the Padlet, I'm going to actually just jump into that Padlet now so I can share it with you in case you can't see it. So this is what it looks like. Or should do. There we go. That's what it looks like. So if you're able to access that, that would be great. While we're here, there are just two things that I'd like you to do. Firstly, have a go at answering the question, what is blended learning? Just have a go and tap that plus button and add a post to the column answering that question. And also, later on, we're going to test out Edpuzzle. If you've had a go at using Edpuzzle before, if you could have a go at downloading the app, this link will take you to a Android and Apple kind of link. So have a go at answering the question, and I'll give you a minute or two. And I'm going to put the link to the Padlet back up now. So it's good to see people already sharing their ideas of what they think blended learning is. It's definitely had lots of definitions over time. It's developed a lot. So maybe we all have blended learning definitions that we used to know, or we've learned recently. I'm going to go about 30 more seconds. Got quite a lot in there. So I'm going to have a look through. So for then people who might not be able to see the Padlet, here we go. So we've got blended learning is incorporating both online and instruction, utilizing a variety of approaches. Yep, blended learning, integrating digital technologies with classroom learning and teaching instruction, combination of online and face-to-face teaching. Yep, so we've got a lot of face-to-face and online combinations. So that it seems like a lot of people who already know quite a bit about blended learning. So that's great. So feel free to carry on adding your thoughts there. But we're going to move on. And also, if you've had a chance to download the app for your device, Edpuzzle, that'll be good for a little activity later. So let's move on. So here's the shortest definition I kind of had for blended learning: the integration of face-to-face learning with an online element. This covers the two most important aspects you have to have for blended learning. Firstly, there needs to be an in-person face-to-face element. So it's not just online, it's not distance learning or online teaching purely. There is a face-to-face in-person element. And secondly, there's some sort of technology mediated, internet probably based component online. Here's one of the most official definitions you can get for blended learning by a guy called Norm Friesen. Blended learning is an approach to education that combines online educational materials and opportunities for interaction online with traditional place-based classroom methods. And I've actually put a link in the Padlet to a paper by Friesen, so you can kind of take a look at that in a bit more detail. The key thing is that there's a significant amount of physical presence and the digital technology, but everything is kept as flexible as possible to maximize learning. So for me, blended learning takes the best parts of learning in school, online, independently, collaboratively, teacher-led, etc., and just mashes them all together, as the name suggests. You can have a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous learning. Students can be working in a whole variety of ways, collaborating together. And so there is no one specific way of blended learning. There are lots of different ways. So there are various models that we're going to quickly whiz through. There's this rotational model where you would expect to have more direct instruction with the teacher talking, what that might look like in a traditional class. Then you have students working collaboratively with each other in a group, and you also have students working independently online. And this could be a rotation either within a lesson or within a sequence of lessons, or even throughout a day if your school or learning environment had a blended learning approach. And then there are also several more models. So we have three here. The flex model, which is kind of, I think, the simplest one, where the teacher is in the room kind of facilitating, helping the students learning online. They're all learning the same thing, but maybe they're kind of slightly moving at their own pace, depending on the activities. Then we have the self-blending model, where students might be taking different courses. And as the teacher in the room, you're kind of there helping students go at their own pace with different courses happening. And so the students might be following a completely independent pathway to each other, and you as the teacher are really facilitating them. Then this enriched virtual model is mainly online. It's often used in adult education settings. So it might be that at the start of a professional development course, you have a face-to-face model where everybody comes together, and then you have kind of follow-up sessions online and maybe come together every now and again. So it's kind of periodically. And I feel like as teachers, we probably incorporated many of these models as part of our day-to-day teaching, without it being really defined as blended learning. And particularly with a lot of working online recently, we're kind of flipping backwards and forwards between online and face-to-face. So blended learning and thinking about blended learning becomes more and more important. So thinking of blended learning as a model is useful to explain what it can be, but also how do we go about planning or designing blended learning? So here we have a blended learning approach or cycle, and it starts with lesson design. Following on from that, you design the lesson and you kind of post that information in an online space. I'm sure you all use many online spaces. Teams, here we are today, is an online space. Today we started off looking in Padlet, having a bit of go at answering a question. And I'm sure many of us are used to using many others. It could be Google Classroom, Firefly, Seesaw, Moodle, or a website. So the next stage is engagement with digital tools. So students actually kind of doing their thing, doing whatever the activities are. It could be in a Google Docs, it could be Word, it could be on paper and pencil and then kind of photographing it. And then it's shared back into that online space. So you share it with the teacher, so the teacher can review, assess, give feedback back in that online space usually. Or it might be that the cycle goes back to lesson design with you redesigning an element of that lesson to kind of address common misconceptions. Maybe something didn't work out the first time and that needed correcting. So there's kind of two pathways that finish that cycle. So today we're going to dive a bit deeper into this cycle, starting with lesson design. Now, we're all used to designing lessons all the time. The more experienced teacher you are, the less time and thinking it takes to plan your lesson, and the more adaptive and reflexive you can be in the classroom. But when we're thinking about blended learning and students learning in their own time or following instructions online, it's really important, and we have to be a lot more intentional with our planning. And so it's good to go back to the basics. So we're going to go quickly back to the basics here. So for online blended learning, we're thinking here about backward design as a good starting point. So quite simply, when we're talking about backward design, we start with the outcomes or goals. Sometimes people kind of want to use technology, and I'm a music teacher, so sometimes people say, oh, I really want to use like this music app, GarageBand, in my lessons. And the question comes back to, well, why do you want to use this app? Like, what are your outcomes or goals? Anyway, I've got a little video for us to explain this backward design. So let's take a listen to that.
So backward design is an instructional design framework that actually comes out of the K-12 world, and the folks who are kind of cited as the founders or the primary influence are Wiggins and McTighe, and they have a series of very practical workbooks and workshops around how one can think about the design of learning environments in terms of learning first. And so that may seem obvious and not backward, but essentially what they say is that often we begin with what things we want people to do in the classroom. Oh, I want my students to make an annotated bibliography, say, or I want my students to do this experiment. And essentially what they say is, by starting with activities, you are forced to map in the wrong direction toward what it is you want people to learn. And so what they propose is, at its basic level, a three-step process that starts with, what goals do you have for your students? That is, what is it that you want them to be able to know and do by the time they've finished your class or your learning experience or your program of study or whatever it is? What are the competencies, and in different disciplines, these have different terminologies, right? Core competencies you hear sometimes, skills, we have the essential learning outcomes. One could argue that learning outcomes are goals, but what is it that you want people to be able to know and do? And then they say, oftentimes, if people have started with that, they will then jump to activities. Well, I want people to know how to analyze a 20th century fiction text, so I'm going to have them write a paper on some 20th century fiction text of their choosing.
Okay, so I'm pausing that because I am aware that maybe many people aren't able to watch the video if the connection isn't massively strong, but hopefully lots of you were able to watch that, and there's a link for that in the Padlet if you want to go and watch that whole video. So here we have backward design, and for backward design there are 3 key questions that I think it's good to ask ourselves. Firstly, what do we want them to be able to do or know? As in, why are we learning this? Why is it so important? And then secondly, there are questions around assessment. How are we going to assess? What are the assessment for success criteria? What types of assessment are we using? Formative or summative? And then finally, lesson design. What activities will I design to meet the outcomes or goals? So let's start with number 1, outcomes or goals. So these are going to be completely personal to each of us as in our teaching context. So I can tell you about my outcomes or goals for some of my lessons recently, but I'm more interested to hear about yours. So here's a challenge for you in the Padlet, and I'll share the link again in a minute. Can you give an outcome or goal in your subject area or classroom? Maybe choose something that you've taught really recently and have a go at popping that into the Padlet. So here's the link to that Padlet again. Be brave, have a go at sharing an outcome or goal for one of your lessons. So I've shared an example of a goal I've used in my classroom to be able to play 3 chords on a ukulele. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to give everyone a chance to share. I'm just going to pop out to the Padlet so we can see what's going on there. So the link, tinyurl.com/ISAPblend. If you've got a camera-enabled phone, you can scan the QR. Great to see people already adding stuff there. So one of the reasons, obviously, I chose to use Padlet today is because I really like it as a blended learning tool, and particularly for teacher professional development. And it's free. You can have 3 boards to start with. So this is 1 board. So I really enjoy using it as well because it's just a quick drop space for everything. So we've got some good learning objectives or outcomes, goals, be able to write formulas and naming iconic compounds, be able to trace straight and diagonal lines, to find and plot a regression line for a given data set. Wow. So we've got all these shared outcomes or goals for our class, some really great examples. Be able to distinguish features of each season. So let's head back on over to the slide. So then, having come up with our kind of goals and outcomes, we'll move on to assessment. Now, some people find it easier to think about assessment than sometimes the goals or outcomes. I really like to use success criteria when I'm thinking about assessment. It's like a checklist for students, really. I like to combine these with what are also known as single point rubrics, and there's a link on the Padlet for more information about that. But here's an example of a single point rubric. So here the goal or outcome is to know how to make breakfast in bed, incredibly important skill that all children should learn for their parents. So if I wanted my students to know how to make breakfast in bed, here are the success criteria of what that would look like. For me, it works really well as a feedback tool, because if students exceed the success criteria, you can add comments in here about how they've exceeded. You know, maybe the presentation's even better than was expected, or maybe the food is perfect. And then over on the other side, we've got areas for improvement, and that's why it's kind of a single point rubric, because you can kind of fill in the bits for yourself. Now, maybe you have some awesome ideas for assessment too. So I've left a space on the Padlet so you can share your ideas too. So anybody has got some stuff to share on kind of assessment, please feel free to do that. It's great to kind of build community and learn from others. Now we've whizzed through the assessment, kind of let's move on to lesson design. So what activities are learners going to do? What activities are learners going to do to demonstrate their learning? So let's go back to the goal I mentioned for my music classroom. So my goal was to make sure they can play 3 chords on the ukulele, to be able to play 3 chords. So for me, the success criteria is that they can play the chords with a good sound and swap between those chords easily. Then the activities they might do would be to learn to play some songs, and then I'd probably make some video tutorials for them so that they can do this in their own time, maybe at home or in a lunch break. Then I think I'll get them to make a video of themselves demonstrating how to play those 3 chords and play the chords along to a backing track that I've made. And I'll probably need some video tutorials to go with that too. So it can be a lot of work when we're designing blended learning, because all of the resources ideally are accessible all the time. And, you know, as many of us have been working online with our students, we probably already are very aware of how much work it is. Here's another way to think about blended learning. So with traditional in the classroom lessons, most of the work kind of happens during the lesson. Particularly as experienced teachers, we're really good at planning our lessons and being flexible. But for blended learning, as I said before, everything has to be planned out in advance. Visualizing the entire process and kind of making sure all the instructions are clear and there's a kind of a pathway for student success. And it's quite a challenge. I've definitely found that I've made lots of mistakes recently where I just haven't been as explicit as I should have been. So it's good to always have a go at this. Now it's your turn to have a go at lesson design. Let's go back to the breakfast in bed goal. How would you go about designing the lesson? What activities would you plan that allow the students to learn and demonstrate their knowledge? And then what I want you to do is share your ideas in the Padlet. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to have a go at thinking about, you know, what assessment activities would you put in there? What activities would you design to allow students to meet these success criteria? Sometimes it's good to go back to thinking about assessment and the ways you would assess. Quite often assessment and activity design are connected. So I'm going to give you 2 to 3 minutes to have a go at sharing your ideas, and then we'll have a look in the Padlet to see what you've come up with. So we're under point 3, what activities would you design to meet the breakfast in bed criteria? Great to see people sharing their assessment ideas as well. That artwork score is, I often score my work 1 to 4. Let's head over to the Padlet. So we've got people sharing their ideas. Lots of role play. That's interesting. So really have a look at the success criteria here and think about maybe different activities that help students meet the criteria for these performances. So what kind of activities would the students be able to do to demonstrate, for example, presentation? I like this one, make meals from modeling clay and present on a paper plate. I love the idea that students would be designing their own kind of breakfast in a safe way, and then peer assessing each other. That sounds like a great idea. And then sketching a design of what the tray would look like. Yeah, drawing pictures, give them the components and practice. What about if they're doing this activity at home? Do you think that they could actually have a go at making a breakfast in bed? I like the healthy versus junk food chart. Yeah, very interesting to see what people think of for breakfast. And I think when we talk about designing activities, this is where you really need to think about your students and kind of the empathy involved with designing activities and thinking, well, what resources do these students have to be able to kind of do these activities if they're at home or if they're in a classroom. So it's very context specific to you and your students. Just going to give you about 1 more minute to think more about this. Got some really good surveys. Survey parents, what parents like for a meal. That's a really good point. Students could be doing research into what their parents feel is a successful breakfast in bed. What food do they want? How to set up the table and decorate a plate. That's a great one. So we're going to head back on over here. Hopefully you've still got a chance to add your ideas. So if it was me, I'd probably make a video tutorial for my students of how to make a breakfast. Again, it would depend on the context. Maybe I like the idea of people using kind of modeling with clay. So if I were face-to-face in the classroom, I might model it using the clay and then do a film of that as well, and then get the students to have a go at that themselves. If I was in a educational kind of space with the cooking facilities, then maybe they could actually have a go at cooking and learning how to kind of get things at the right temperature. Lots of things to do with health and safety. Lots of people already said this about doing research first with their parents about what they wanted for breakfast. They could even kind of create a kind of survey, and they could share a screenshot of that. Remember, we're probably looking at getting students to share their work to some kind of digital learning space. If we were looking at this, we've got this kind of student product shared to an online classroom space there. If they were actually making the food at home, then they would be able to kind of maybe share photos of their breakfast in bed that they'd made. And then finally, perhaps they could do an interview and record that, maybe film or audio with their family member to get feedback. Obviously, it's just a very silly task. So thanks everybody for bearing with me on that one. But it does bring up a lot of questions. What digital tools are available for our students to use in their context, and how will they share that with the teacher? So it's a good kind of discussion point. So this is where we come back to this blended learning cycle, where we haven't talked about assessment and feedback specifically about the breakfast and bed task, but you can see that going back to this success criteria, each student could be given feedback with areas for improvement and evidence of exceeding those standards. And then obviously we might have to redesign our lesson based on kind of, quite often you'll find that I find that students have done something completely different to what I asked them to do, and it's usually because I haven't properly explained things as well as I thought I had in the first place. This is where we're at. One thing I haven't really talked about much is about which online classroom space you should use. And I think that's very much because of your context with your students and your school or learning environment. Depending on the age of the students, I totally recommend using Seesaw or Google Classroom. But the main thing is, rather than swapping between lots of different apps, it's best to kind of stick with one space. And even email or this Padlet is a kind of a great simple space to go with if you're not sure what to do. So talking about the kind of tools, for my ukulele project that I've been doing with my students, I know the students have iPads and they have a ukulele, and they know how to use Google Classroom. And so I've shared all the resources and assessment criteria in the Google Classroom in that online space. Students know how to use the digital tools already, but I don't know if they've got good internet connections, and I think that's something that varies very much for our students. Sometimes text is better than video if students don't have access to the internet. And in that case, a textbook is going to be a lot more useful than online resources. I've got a little table here to kind of give you a look at that. So what we have is kind of From kind of on the vertical axis, we've got low bandwidth, so stuff that doesn't require a lot of internet. At the bottom there, kind of email, reading with text and images, all the way up to kind of discussions with video like we are now, that requires quite a lot of high bandwidth, whether that's pre-recorded video in the top left-hand corner. So on the horizontal axis, we've got what they've called low immediacy, so maybe more asynchronous kind of activities. And then on the right-hand side, high immediacy, so we've got group chat and collaborative documents. I like this table for helping me think about what's going to be best for my activities based on the context of my students. I've shared some ideas on the Padlet of some digital tools I use all the time with different classes, but please also feel free to share the tools you like best. One tool I really like for blended learning that I want to share with you today is Edpuzzle, because it makes watching videos a lot more interactive. So right now I've created an activity for us to complete together in Edpuzzle. So you can either scan the QR code shown on screen or head over to the Padlet. You might have already seen the link under Edpuzzle quiz called Cat Quiz earlier. I already mentioned to try and download that app on your phone, because unfortunately it does need an app to work. And also the bottom there is a class code to put in there. Don't worry if you didn't manage it. I'm gonna play it together on the screen just to give you an idea. I'll give you a quick taster of how Edpuzzle works. I use it a lot with my students, particularly older students, where I'm wanting them to watch quite complicated videos, but how do I check that they've watched the videos? This is a very quick assessment tool that allows me to do that. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to scan the code and get on. We're going to head over to Edpuzzle and have a go at this now. Okay, so what I have here is I have a video of that I've got on YouTube. You might have seen this video before, and I've set it up with some multiple choice questions and some other questions here. So you should be able to press play and have a go at this yourself. If you've got it working, have a go. Otherwise, we're going to have a quick go together. So I'm going to press play. And what it does is it pauses. So here we've got a question on the right-hand side. How many cats can you see? Well, let's say I can see 6 cats. 1, 2, 3, yep, 6, maybe 7, or maybe I can't count today. Oh, I got it wrong. I could re-watch. Yes, it was 7 cats, but I'm going to continue. And you can also add notes at certain points in the video. So I was quite surprised at the size of this cat. And how many hands do cats have? It's a very stupid question. Let's go with 2 hands, obviously. Cats have 2 hands. Yep, I got that right. And you can also add open-ended questions as well. So if you have the app, why not have a go at filling in this open-ended question, showing how you think you could use this app to support blended learning in your classroom. So just going to give everybody a minute to have a go at answering that question. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to kind of share their ideas. And I like this, it says watch the whole video to turn in the assignment, so students have to go all the way to the end. So you should then be able to go back in, because it's an open class, it's not going to show everybody's responses like it would be if I had students, but here's a grade book, for example, so I can have a grade book for all of my classes there. So I really like this app a lot. So if we go to ISAT, it's in progress. We've got 8 new answers here. Let's have a look. Let's go with the questions. So I can see 17 out of 50 people got this right. That's weird. I think lots of people got it wrong. Yep, 10 out of 50 right. So 10 people know that cats have 2 hands. And then we've got some open-ended questions here, and we can go in and have a look at people's answers. So Orange Rabbit says, I would definitely use this for assessment purposes. Oh yeah, forced pauses and responses to questions are great. And the stats is really helpful too. And as the jellyfish says here, kids love digital interaction, so this is going to keep them attentive all the time. Great. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an intro to Edpuzzle. So I've got a little picture here for you. I guess finally, one of the things I want to say is that the takeaway message is that blended learning isn't really about technology. It's not the most important thing. So when it comes to blended learning or any learning, we're not focusing on the technology. A British phrase for this is don't put the cart before the horse. It should be the horse, as in the pedagogy leading the way, leading the learning. And so often we're told that put the pedagogy first and technology second. But one of the things I want to mention about blended learning is that really neither are true. If you put the pedagogy first and then think about the technology, you might find that you're using technology that doesn't really suit the purposes or your context. I think really that you have to think about the pedagogy and the technology at the same time. So when you are designing your learning activities, you need to be thinking about your context and the technology that you can use for your students. Thinking about the car and the horse at the same time, really. And the key thing is to start with the learning goals and aims. What do you want them to be able to know, understand, and be able to do? So to finish, let's remind ourselves of what blended learning is. Here's the definition I started off with, the integration of face-to-face learning with an online element. But it's also probably remembering why we want to do a blended learning approach in the first place. And that's really to empower the learner. It creates a flexible learning environment for them so that they can learn independently, anytime, anywhere, in an environment that's very comfortable to them. It doesn't replace normal learning. It enhances it with technology and the opportunities that online learning affords. And particularly at the moment where we're swapping between face-to-face and online learning, the blended learning approach is a really good way of merging the two so that you are really agile and flexible and able to have a smooth transition alternating between online and face-to-face teaching. And that's something I found really useful is I've kind of adapted my face-to-face teaching to make it more blended so that when students are working at home, or I've got some students working in class and some students are kind of in quarantine, not able to come into school, and having all that resources kind of, I'm getting into a kind of routine of making sure that everything is there available for the students. Let's take some questions. As Duncan said, if you could type your questions into the chat box, then someone from the ISAT team will be able to ask the questions out loud.
Stephen, just before people are typing questions in, I'd like to thank you for your insights on blended learning, and just to say that I'm sure that all of us fully appreciate your some of the things we picked up. You know, the use of Padlet and Edpuzzle, especially using something like CATS to grab people's attention. And during online learning, when the students have had to be at home, we've needed this sort of information more than ever. You know, the ability to use some new technologies and apps to help the children continue to make great progress at home. And also, when you just mentioned near the end about that sometimes we've got sometimes got students in front of us in the classroom, some are possibly in a hotel in quarantine, and some are actually still at home. So now more than ever, I should imagine, the blended learning approach has been very, very useful. So thank you so much for that. We have a few questions. I've got one from Olivia that's asking, do you use a progress tracker sheet to monitor students' progress when they are on different learning paths at their own pace? If so, what form does that take?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing I would say is obviously it's dependent on your context. And what I do is I use Google Classroom, and within Google Classroom, every time you set an assignment, it gives you the opportunity to add a score and to grade that assignment. And so what I do is I do what someone has kindly shared in the Padlet. I'm just going to quickly pop back over to that over here. So when someone's done it for art, I just have a basic score of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Hopefully it's going to appear on the screen shortly. That I can assess all of the work. I also break down everything into sequential tasks and make sure that everything is labeled clearly. So whereas in the classroom, we might have tasks that are long or longer, I break them down into much smaller kind of manageable chunks so I can check that students haven't gone off in the wrong direction and done something wrong. So I break everything into much smaller tasks and then give very clear feedback, 1, 2, 3, or 4, as to whether they've done the right thing. And often I give whole class feedback because I personally teach about 500 students. And so I can't necessarily give individual feedback for each student's work, but I can kind of give an overview of kind of whole class feedback. And that might be through pre-recorded video if we're online, or in the classroom, I might just bring up some students' work as an example. Hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Stephen. I know the worry about people tracking the progress of students when they're remote is something I think people are becoming more confident with, and those practical solutions are definitely very helpful. One more, James is asking, I use Edpuzzle, but I cannot see their responses. Do they need a Google account, or can I assign this in another way? I teach primary students who do not have an email address.
So the answer is yes. The activity we did today was with an open class. So you can create an open class. And so all of these students on the left-hand side here, they're participants today. These aren't their real names. They have just been assigned. Obviously, in a virtual environment, that might be a more challenge to get there. But yes, this is the best way to do it. You don't need Google accounts, but you would then have to set them up you'd have to create a class in Edpuzzle, and then you'd have to individually add names. So here on the screen, we've got the classic type where students log in or sign up into Edpuzzle, or you've got this open option. And this tick box here says, let Edpuzzle generate students' nicknames. So if you have that unticked, students should be able to generate their own nicknames. Good question. You can also connect it to Google Classroom and other learning platforms as well.
Stephen, thank you again. I can't see any other questions on the chat, but so on behalf of everybody that's participated today, I'd really like to share our appreciation for your thoughts and your insights. And I should imagine that many of the things you said today will have a direct and profound impact on our students that we work with. So thank you so much on behalf of ISAP and all the participants.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. That Padlet I'll be leaving up for a month or so. So feel free to add stuff or access anything, particularly if you've got any good assessment ideas or tools that you use that you think will be useful for the rest of the community. And please do share them there so we can all kind of learn from each other.
That's
Thank
great.
you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all the participants that took part. And please look out for some more ISAT webinar sessions and come along and take part. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.